Neo-hegelianism. The relatively short Hegel Renaissance in the imperialist era was preceded by a much longer period during which Hegel was accorded no recognition at all. But the fact that Hegel fell into oblivion is, historically considered, only one side, by far the less important one, of the history of his influence. Germany's post-1848 bourgeoisie took the view that in order to reach its goals, it no longer needed even the reactionary elements in Hegel's philosophy, and that neo-Kantian positivism and agnosticism rendered Hegel completely superfluous as far as it was concerned. But whereas at the one extreme, Hegel's reactionary systematizing tendencies vanished from the philosophical scene, that which was alive, forward-looking and progressive in his thought, namely the dialectical method, entered into the higher world outlook, into dialectical materialism. This is not the place to discuss how fundamental a reconstruction of Hegel's dialectics, as well, had to be carried out in the process. It would be to simplify and falsify history to assume that a certain changing of the terms would suffice to get from Hegel's idealist to Marx's materialist dialectics. Between Hegel and Marx there was a qualitative leap of world historical significance. With Marx there came about, as compared to all that had gone before, a qualitatively new philosophy, a new dialectic. The result of this relationship of Hegel to Marx was that even those progressive elements in Hegel's dialectic with which Marx could associate himself had to be thoroughly transformed, as regards both form and content, and critically re-worked in the materialistic dialectic. Little though this procedure was understood by bourgeois philosophy, it's 547. 548. The destruction of reason. Presence must have likewise become a co-determining reason for bourgeois thoughts turning away from Hegel. Bernstein, a blind adherent of bourgeois philosophical tendencies and the founder of revisionism, expressed this state of things the most clearly when he simultaneously sought to make Kant the philosopher of seasonable Marxism and attacked Marx on account of his Hegelianism. Because of the dialectical character of his doctrine, meanwhile Bernstein had, like all revisionists, taken in tow many bourgeois tendencies that were already obsolete. Hardly had he accomplished his purge of Marxism from its Hegelian traces than more perspicacious bourgeois thinkers began to realize that the reactionary elements in Hegel under imperialistic conditions could, suitably recast, be rendered useful to the bourgeoisie's needs for a world outlook. The defeat of the 1848 revolution finished off the collapse of the Hegelian system on the German philosophical scene. Rudolf Heim's book on Hegel, which was crucial to the assessment of Hegel for a long period and carries weight even now as regards numerous points, summed up most effectively this coming to terms with the dialectical method. Naturally it cannot be said that all Hegelians had now disappeared from the face of the earth. Many continued their activities. Indeed, for a long time there existed in Berlin a society of Hegelians which even published its own periodical. But only a handful, as for example Adolf Lassen, remained loyal to orthodox Hegelianism. To be sure, this orthodoxy must be properly understood from the historical angle. Those contradictions openly emerging between Hegel's dialectical method and the Hegelian system in the period spanning the July Revolution and 1848 found in dialectical materialism a solution on a qualitatively higher plane. The bourgeois Hegelians distanced themselves more and more from this algebra of revolution, as Alexander. Neo-hegelianism. 549. Herzen called it. Orthodoxy of the type which Lassen was practicing signified adherence to the Hegelian system, with all its often retrograde results. And precisely this adherence amid a German development which, around 1871 and beyond, was leading into Wilhelmine imperialism, inevitably exacerbated the conflict between system and method from the reactionary side and forced the dialectical method into the background. Even Lassalle, who considered himself an orthodox Hegelian and wanted to be a revolutionary at the same time, was obliged to subjectify the dialectical method in many ways and to bring it nearer to Fichte. Under the pressure of current events and trends, there arose with the majority of Hegelians a, conscious or unconscious, movement away from Hegel's doctrine and method to an increasing degree. Many of them were now drawing closer to the Kantianism increasingly in evidence, without always registering the fact that they were thereby breaking with the Hegelian method. Others, drawing closer and closer to the positivism also emerging at that time, were already starting to bring irrationalist tendencies into philosophy. A sharply dismissive criticism of dialectics, represented chiefly by Trendelenburg, Schopenhauer, etc., dominated philosophical opinion to a growing extent. Hegelian philosophy was treated as an outdated metaphysic. Hence Marx was quite right to say that in Germany, Hegel was being treated as old hat just as much as Spinoza had been in his own period. One, the Neo-Kantianism, which had notably gained in strength after the defeat of the 1848 revolution, officially voiced the philosophical burial of Hegel. It interpreted the development of German philosophy from Fichte to Hegel as a major aberration for which amends could only be made by a resolute divorce from it and an unqualified return to what was purportedly the sole scientific philosophy, that of Kant. This view held sway in German philosophy until the imperialistic period. Only in this period did it become more widely and strongly. 550. The destruction of reason. Palpable that purely positivistic Neo-Kantianism was incapable of mastering the problems which the age was setting philosophers. In the so-styled Southwest German school, there very soon sprang up a movement back to Fichte. Nietzsche's influence was growing all the time, and parallel to it in all spheres of the historical sciences, there was now originating a markedly positive revaluation of Romanticism which related not only to the Romantic school in the narrower sense, but also led to a revival of Schelling and schleiermacher. All such tendencies were connected with that general need of a worldview by the imperialistic German bourgeoisie which we have already encountered. They were connected with the insight that it was impossible to prepare ideologically for the great internal, and, above all, outward struggles of the time on the basis of formalistic neo-Kantian thinking. It was in this intellectual milieu that the revival of Hegelian philosophy began in the pre-war period. Earlier on, the origin of a new Hegelian bias had already been ascertained by the accredited philosophers, above all Windelband in his Academy speech. He too saw that the general hunger for a worldview formed the basis of this movement. But whilst recognizing its existence and its relative justification, his speech aimed chiefly at defining in advance the limits of the neo-Hegelian movement and warning the philosophical world of the dangers which such a movement could induce. Here Windelband formulated, albeit in the form of an advanced staking of boundaries, an important element of the neo-Hegelian movement in the imperialistic era, the preservation of the link with Kant. The neo-Kantian concept of value, that is, subjective idealism, was, to his mind, the farthest point to which critical philosophical analysis can penetrate. 3. The rejection of the dialectical method was very closely bound up with this standpoint. Our later studies will show that here, too, Windelband anticipated an important element in the later development of Neo-hegelianism, the rejection of the dialectical. Neo-hegelianism. 551. Method, whether explicit or tacit, was to become a constant feature of the whole Hegelian revival. Granted, as a Kantian, Windelband formulated this in a negative spirit, in that he did not allow that such a dialectic as a whole might form the method of philosophy. Again, point 4. This eloquent warning from Windelband was superfluous. For the German neo-Hegelians had not the least thought of repeating Hegel's break with Kantian philosophy. As we know, Hegel always strongly repudiated Kant's subjective idealism, and in particular its denial of the perceptibility of the thing in itself. The knowableness of it was a salient point in his dialectical epistemology, for this implied the dialectical relativity of phenomenon and essence, of the phenomenon and the thing in itself. If the properties of things have been perceived, then so have the things themselves, and the in themselves become for us, and under certain conditions for themselves. Leaving aside this process of concrete perception leading from phenomenon to essence, the thing in itself, according to Hegel, was an empty and meaningless abstraction. The imperialist revivers of Hegel were far from even considering this criticism of Kant, let alone adopting it. They continued to abide by a modified neo-Kantian standpoint suited to the conditions of the imperialistic era, that is, they went on mechanically dividing phenomenon from essence and did not admit of the existence and perceptibility of objective reality. If they were renewing Hegel, they present him, in contrast to his true historical character, as the consummate scion of Kant's philosophy, not as a thinker surmounting it. This epistemological foundation was very vividly expressed in a small book by Julius Ebbinghaus, a book which, although it did not become widely known, had a decisive influence on the method and views of the later, more influential neo-Hegelians. We may briefly summarize Ebbinghaus' basic idea by saying that Hegel simply thought through to their logical conclusion all the consequences of Kant's transcendental method, whereas 552. The destruction of reason. Kant himself only half thought them out. Thus Hegelianism was nothing beyond a really rigorous, consistent Kantianism. Hence Ebbinghaus formulated the task facing Neo-Hegelianism as follows: to develop the form of the philosophical principle out of the determinants of the Kantian one, liberated from its faint-heartedness. 5. This leads to the second important thesis in the Neo-Hegelian conception of the history of philosophy, the unity of classical German philosophy, which amounts to the blurring of any basic difference between Fichte, Schelling and Hegel. Ebbinghaus stated that no difference can be found as regards the principle in the constructions of that speculative philosophy preached from Fichte to Hegel, if they are grasped at once in their full scope. 6. That was a considerable step backwards in comparison to the findings reached in Hegel's History of Philosophy and subsequently by Erdmann or Kuno Fischer. Although they too presented the development from Kant to Hegel in an all too straightforward way, one does however see very well, especially in Hegel's own account, that, precisely with regard to philosophical principles, notable cracks, clefts, gaps, etc., occur along this line. But a searching and open-minded historical investigation would be bound to show that the road from Kant to Hegel was by no means so straight and direct as Hegel himself portrays it. To be sure, the development did have a certain unity to it. This was already so by dint of the fact that, without exception, the important German classical thinkers sought answers to the concrete questions of their time, the time of the French Revolution. But here the unity lay in the common social being and in its intellectual reflections. The roads to realization, on the other hand, were far more complicated, circuitous and uneven than Hegel himself portrayed them. Now Ebbinghaus, by laying down a unity of principle behind the development from Kant to Hegel, lowered the whole of German classical Neo-Hegelianism. 553. Philosophy to the plane of Kantian subjective idealism. He was thereby discounting its cardinal achievements, in particular the elaboration of the dialectical method, which Ebbinghaus and his successors presented as just an organic continuous scion of Kantian transcendental philosophy which never surpassed the latter in theory. So Hegelian philosophy was seen as the peak of an unbroken continuation of Kantianism. Thus Hegel was traced back to Fichte, objective to subjective idealism. In Absolute Idealism, Ebbinghaus wrote, "The not one is completely dissolved in the process of the I, the object is wholly and fully a knowing." 7. That was, at best, a modernized Fichte, but it passed over the new element in the young Schelling's natural philosophy regardless and ignored all that Hegel had done to enrich philosophical knowledge. These theses of Ebbinghaus became exemplary for and fundamental to the development of German Neo-hegelianism, the imperialist period. This was not, however, the only contribution to the renewal of Hegel, indeed not even the chief contribution. The book most important to the Hegel Renaissance in Germany was the Old Dilthey's Die, Eugengeschichte Hegels, the Story of Hegel's Youth, 1905. On the crucial epistemological questions, however, this most influential pioneer of the Hegel revival stood, as we have noted, extraordinarily close to Neo-Kantianism. With regard to the speculative method, Dilthey stated very firmly, here, too, Kant's limiting definitions remain victorious. 8. Similarly, and despite all their other differences, he agreed with Windelband in rejecting the dialectic method. Analyzing the speculative method, he wrote, "Equally the means of solving this falsely set task, namely the dialectic method, is completely useless, as Trent Ellenberg has convincingly proved." 9. The otherwise greatly diverging tendencies of the Neo-Hegelians were therefore at one concerning the central question, in their rejection of the dialectic method. But the importance of Dilthey's book lay elsewhere, in that he discovered, as it were, the young Hegel. He wrote 554. The Destruction of Reason. Change that was of great moment for Hegel interpretation. He brought him into direct proximity to the irrationalistic vitalism of the imperialist period, whose most important proponent was Dilthey himself. To be sure, his carrying over of vitalism into Hegel's thought was confined to the young Hegel, in whose work he ascertained a period of mystical pantheism. During this period, Dilthey thought, Hegel represented vitalism. Hegel defines the character of all reality through the concept of life. 10. This was a misrepresentation that stood on its head the whole of the young Hegel's development. Dilthey, by introducing an imperialist vitalistic slant, was distorting both the crisis in which Hegel renounced the republican enthusiasm for the French Revolution and his investigation into the economic foundations of bourgeois society, as also the dialectic method originating in this context. But this distortion enabled the new view of Hegel to fit in with the great vogue of irrationalism. On this question, too, see my aforementioned book on the young Hegel. And that Dilthey confined this interpretation to the young Hegel was, as we shall see, rich in consequences, inasmuch as later, there arose in Neo-Hegelianism a strong tendency to play off the young Hegel, as the authentic and genuine one, against the old. There are two further considerations. Firstly, Dilthey, himself one of the most important renewers of romantic thought in the imperialist era, complemented Ebbinghaus's uniting of Kant, Fichte, Schelling and Hegel by laying down also a unifying link between Hegel and the whole romantic movement, Friedrich's schedule, Schleiermacher. Schelling, and in order to prove it, he did not shrink from the grossest distortion of history, for Hegel was a decided adversary to every form of German romanticism from the very outset. His early polemic against F.H. Jacobi was aimed at the Romantics, even where the latter are not expressly mentioned. In the conclusion of Belief and Knowledge, he openly and sharply opposed the chief theoretical work of Romanticism, Schleiermacher's Talks on Religion. He maintained an Neo-Hegelianism 555. Intensely hostile attitude towards this author all his life. The romantic theory of art Hegel dismissed in the introduction to his philosophy of art, his philosophy of right teamed with the sharpest polemics against the representatives of the historical school of law and romantic political and social theory, while the introduction to his phenomenology of the mind was directed against Schelling's romantic and intuitionistic epistemology, against intellectual intuition and so forth. Let us mention in passing that for their part, the Romantics judged Hegel in an equally hostile and dismissive fashion. Friedrich's schedule, for instance, saw in the Hegelian dialectic a kind of Satanism. Only between Hegel and the most important of romantic aestheticians, Solger, whose dialectic surpassed the Romantic age in various ways, do we find mutual respect despite the numerous critical reservations on both sides. If a historian of Dilthey's knowledge and standing could ignore such obvious facts, if he could leave out of his Hegel portrait precisely the original's essential features, there is only one explanation. It is that Dilthey unhistorically and uncritically ascribed to Hegel his own attitude, which was vitalistic in the modern sense. In romantic thinking he correctly located tendencies which had affinities with his own. Secondly, Dilthey was seeking a historical basis for linking Hegel with the modern age. This bent had a real foundation inasmuch as the effects of Hegelian philosophy on German historical studies, religious studies, law, aesthetics, etc., were indeed uncommonly wide-ranging and profound, and they long survived the collapse of the philosophical influence in the narrower sense. In other words, specific tendencies, elements and fragments of Hegelian thinking continued to affect the German social sciences for a very long while, although here again the dialectic method was completely shunned. Since, as we have seen, Dilthey himself rejected it, the Hegelian influence on social studies was almost all that mattered to him. The two endeavors of Dilthey that we have touched on go hand in hand, at the same time that he 556. The destruction of reason. was blurring the distinctions between Hegel and Romantic thought with the historical school belonging to it. He was giving exaggerated weight to Hegel's repercussions on the old Strauss, Zeller and so on. Thus Dilthey, in his renewal of Hegel, was inclined towards proving the hitherto lasting continuity of his influence in the aforestated sense. The historians too helped to reinforce this latter Diltheyan tendency. Those who were carrying on the rank tradition in the imperialist period aimed at portraying Bismarck's founder Schein of the Reich and the Prussianizing of Germany as though no break with classical culture had occurred, as though the Second Reich and, above all, Bismarck had evolved from specific tendencies of around 1900 in the course of a wholly uninterrupted process. They now fitted Hegel into this context. The most influential work in this vein, Minek's World Citizenship and the National State, deliberately drew a line running from Hegel through Rank to Bismarck. Minek stated, thus we now venture to name as the three great liberators of the state, Hegel, Rank and Bismarck. 1. Here similar tendencies prevailed as in Dilthey, but the blurring of the antithesis between Hegel on the one hand, and Romantic thought as well as the historical school and, above all, Rank on the other, now had a marked historico-political character. The existing Bismarck-Hohenzollern-Reich was to be presented as his peak and the legacy of the whole German development in the 19th century, Hegel as a supporting figure on a large statue of Bismarck. But all these attempts to make of Hegel alive and efficacy as contemporary power, a powerhouse of Prusso-Wilhelmine conservatism, proceeded independently before the First Imperialist War and did not yet constitute a clearly defined movement, far less a school. Beside the aforestated tendencies, another aspect of the incipient Hegel vogue was that his philosophy suggested an intellectual force which might be successfully played off against Marxism. In itself, as we have noted, the combating of Marxism, though seldom openly avowed, very often hardly consciously registered, had been Neo-hegelianism. 557. The main bias of irrationalism since Nietzsche, so it is understandable that before the war, there were already attempts to exploit the reactionary facets of Hegelian philosophy against Marx and socialism, on behalf of the ends of the imperialist bourgeoisie. Hammacher and, above all, Plenge came forward with such views. But the influential revisionist wing of German social democracy openly dissociated itself from Marxism's Hegelian legacy, and likewise, the orthodox Marxists who were polemicizing against revisionism had no live contact with it. This applies not only to Kautsky, a man of the center, but also to the bright ideological leader of the left, Franz Mehring. For the chief line of imperialist philosophy's ideological struggle at that time, it thus seemed sufficient to distort Hegelian doctrine in the style of Ebbinghaus or Dilthey. Hence the endeavors of Hammacher and Plenge remained episodes without major consequences. Neo-hegelianism only became a real movement after the German defeat in the First World War. The German bourgeoisie, threatened by revolution and constantly trapped in increasingly critical situations in respect of its attempts at consolidation, its striving to prepare Germany ideologically for fresh imperialist aggression, now sensed the need for a worldview more strongly and was developing it more vigorously than ever. Now Neo-hegelianism also went towards meeting this ideological need. It too was carried along on this general reactionary current, which moved slowly at first but then with torrential force. But it would be wrong to suppose that Neo-hegelianism was ever the really dominant ideology of the German bourgeoisie between the two world wars. During that period its ruling ideology was always, as we have seen, the ever-increasingly radical irrationalism of vitalism, the philosophy which did so much to pave the reactionary German bourgeoisie's way to fascism. Naturally Neo-hegelianism too was quite reactionary enough, but it expressed bourgeois tendencies that were more moderate, more eclectic in a reactionary way, more consolidated. It was, philosophically speaking, an 558. The destruction of reason. Attempt to incorporate irrationalism in a system without giving up rational principles or scientific thinking completely or to a decided extent. We are dealing with a philosophical bias matching those German bourgeois tendencies which were ever present and sometimes came to the forefront, but always remained episodic in the final analysis. And these consisted in absorbing the constructive elements of fascism into a reactionary, unified bourgeois front as a partial and not a principal element. There arose on this basis a synthesis of the neo-Hegelian orientations which had proceeded separately in the pre-war period. Synthesis must here be understood in a very broad and manifold sense. It implied not only the summing up and unification of the pre-war tendencies of which we have spoken, but also a new idea of synthesis which was foisted on Hegel. Interpreting Hegelian philosophy as a synthesis of all orientations of past ages and the age of Hegel himself, the neo-Hegelians now wanted to produce a similar synthesis of all the current philosophical tendencies on a neo-Hegelian basis. They could not or would not see that Hegel took a clearly defined line of his own for the sake of which he fiercely contested all the orientations of his time. Nor could they see that he did not seek in past ages an uncritically eclectic unity, but aimed at demonstrating how dialectics had evolved from the first beginnings of human thought up to what he considered their most advanced form. That inherent in his own system. Thus Hegel synthesized different philosophical trends only to the following extent. On the one hand, he showed that the entire history of philosophy was man's intellectual quest for the genuine philosophical method, the dialectical method. He further showed that while, in the course of this development, the most diverse thinkers according to their times, culture and personality had raised the most diverse problems from the angle of both content and form, there was, nonetheless, a Neo-hegelianism. 559. Unity behind this variety, the objective unity of philosophy, the unity of its cardinal substance, namely the reproduction of reality, as it exists in itself. That is to say, dialectically. Unity of the determining form, of the dialectical method. On the other hand, Hegel saw his own philosophy as an intellectual crowning of sorts of the entire development, for it endeavored to encompass everything which, in the way of progressive tendencies and especially the extending of the dialectical method, past philosophy had first produced and then superseded, thus eliminating its shortcomings while at the same time preserving it and raising it to a higher plane. Not for 1 second, however, did Hegel contemplate a synthesis of the philosophical orientations of his time, a synthesis, say, with Kant or Schleiermacher. The Neo-Hegelians, on the contrary, were seeking a peaceable union of all the reactionary tendencies of their day, a kind of philosophical consolidation, and they now imposed this idea upon Hegel. The methodological basis of this tendency was the complete elimination of dialectics from their picture of Hegel. So the contradictory movement of history that we find in his work was transformed into an Alexandrian eclecticism, a peaceful and static juxtaposition of events. It was such a portrait of Hegel that Kroner tried to sketch in his speech on the 100th anniversary of his death. He compared Hegel with Aristotle and Aquinas as though the former had sought to achieve with Plato, and the latter with Jewish religious thinkers and Mohammedanism, a synthesis akin to that which Kroner was imputing to Hegel. The simple formulation of the question shows his intentions in all clarity. The reason for the influence of Hegel's worldview, he opined, lay in the fact that it brilliantly does justice to the eternal basic motives of thought by arranging the fullness of reality in a hierarchy in which every single thing has its appointed place. Through these architectonics it is capable of uniting even opposites, of achieving a balance between conflicting facts. Here, let us note, Hegel is alleged to have created an architectonic edifice and to have converted the dialectical resolution. 560. The destruction of reason. Of opposites into an agreement between conflicting facts, as though it had ever occurred to him to obtain agreement between, say, Bacon and Descartes. This, however, was only the methodological basis, more important is the concrete content. Kroner stated it programmatically in his inaugural speech at the First Hegel Congress. He dealt with Hegel's adversaries, criticismus and phenomenology, dialectical theology, Heidegger, and so forth, before stating, they are disunited among themselves only because they do not grasp their mutual need for integration, do not mutually penetrate one another and band together. And they are united in opposing Hegel only because in their one-sidedness they exclude not only each other, but by the same token the whole in which they are reduced to elements as well. 13. Glockner supplemented this program very clearly with the following statements, which in part went farther still, in an irrationalistic direction. Everywhere there exists a desire to escape from the rationalism which was generally prevalent in the last third of the century, and which we may label as the New Enlightenment. But it will not do simply to side with the new romanticism which that rationalism summoned up as its antithesis. Here the task is to mediate. Hegel performed that act of mediation which is required in Germany at present. In the name of Hegel the factions can conclude peace and make common cause. 14. Neo-Hegelianism's social content emerges clearly from these remarks. Firstly, Kroner saw in the various lines of thought of the time only partisan views which had not grasped the mutual need for integration, and were combating one another for that reason alone. Their struggles, he believed, had no authentic factual substance to them, and these trends, we must stress this, were not moving in a reactionary direction. So all that was needed for everlasting peace in philosophy was a generally acceptable compromise proposal. Glockner further. Neo-Hegelianism. 561. Supplemented this content by adding that there was justification for a struggle against the New Enlightenment, only, one had to stop short of radical or militant irrationalism. Naturally the world outlook of the working class, Marxism, was excluded from the synthesis. It was rather the case that it opposed Marxism, if not always to a decided extent. The purpose of a philosophical synthesis under Hegel's aegis was a coalition of all bourgeois orientations against the proletariat, the Neo-Hegelians' petty bourgeois narrow-mindedness, which had not a few parallels in politics at that time, consisted chiefly in their reluctance to acknowledge that an effective defensive action on the part of the bourgeoisie would involve violent policy conflicts ending with the victory of the most reactionary wing of monopoly capitalism. And this at a time when the class struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat was become more and more embittered. Here, Neo-Hegelianism, seemingly doing the obvious practical thing but really in a wholly utopian way, was putting itself forward as a suitable umbrella organization for all current reactionary trends of thought. By thus undertaking a synthesis of the various philosophical orientations, Neo-Hegelianism was setting itself the task of guiding the imperialistic post-war crisis of world outlook into normal and ordered channels. In this we can read an essential difference to pre-war times. In its attempt to find a reactionary compromise solution, Neo-Hegelianism acknowledged the fact of such a crisis. This motive could not, in the context of being, have arisen in pre-war philosophy. Siegfried Merrick interpreted Neo-Hegelianism as such a crisis theory in contrast to orthodox Kantianism. Hence he wrote of Rickert. He therefore affirms the bourgeois world epoch, regards its solutions as sound and the epoch itself as in no danger of collapsing, but are not Hegel and Kierkegaard, those mighty and affiliated antipodes of the 19th century. are not the dialecticians of the real and ideal, Harb. 562. The destruction of reason. Inges of a post-Kantian, post-bourgeois and also post-Christian world epoch 15 Kroner 2 stated, modern Kantianism has entered a crisis 16. All this obviously implies a certain distance from Neo-Kantianism. But the repudiation of it was far less radical than that which we have discerned in Glockner with regard to the New Enlightenment, that is, all left-oriented thinking. For nearly all the leading Neo-Hegelians came from Neo-Kantianism, and chiefly from the dark Southwest German school, where Kantianism had always gone farthest in the direction of irrationalism. We must not fail to mention that in 1920, Rickert published a book attacking vitalism. But this book's critique of vitalistic irrationalism cannot hide the fact that it was none other than Rickert who argued in philosophical terms the irrationalism of a large area of knowledge, namely that of historical studies. It matters precious little that the word irrationalism did not actually occur in this epistemological argument, for in essence this theory of history certainly tended in that direction. It is true that by 1920, Rickert was already concerned about the consequences of an extreme irrationalism. This very fact demonstrates, from a different angle, his affinity with the Neo-Hegelians. They too heeded irrationalism and simply wanted to evade its most extreme consequences. Both types of challenge to irrationalism show the same weakness, the total vulnerability of a German intelligentsia which was wholly under its spell, fascinated by it in every respect, but which nonetheless wished to dodge its ultimate consequence. Hitlerianfascism. Without seeking to repel in any way or even to moderate reactionary tendencies to any appreciable extent, these intellectuals wished to steer the troubled post-war developments into ordered channels. That this was politically impossible the outcome of the Weimar period showed clearly enough. The nature and destiny of Neo-Hegelianism reflect the same plight. With the Neo-Hegelians, then, we note a specific dividing. Neo-Hegelianism. 563. Line from the Neo-Kantians, but at the same time a far more marked emphasis on the continuity with Kant and Neo-Kantianism. Glockner even stated, it may sound paradoxical, but in Germany today the Hegel question is primarily a Kant question. 17 And in this respect, the great book by Kroner that had a central influence on Neo-Hegelianism was not much more than a concrete realization of the program constructed by Ebbinghaus in his day. The attempt to prove that Hegel's philosophy had grown out of Kant's as a matter of inner necessity, without departing from the basic principle. Kroner stated, German idealism from Kant to Hegel should be grasped in its development as a single whole, as a line soaring in a splendid curve according to a law inherent in it, and impressing itself nowhere else. One must depict how the Hegelian philosophy of mind has grown out of the Kantian critique of reason. 18 And he added that the major successors to Kant have surpassed him because they understood him. 9 So for Kroner, as for Ebbinghaus, the unity of classical German philosophy was only an unfolding of what was implicitly present in the Kantian conception. And Kroner developed this schema in a consistent way. The Hegelian system, for example, he showed as deriving straight from Schelling's philosophy. Where, however, he could no longer conceal the open break between Hegel and Schelling in the phenomenology of the mind, he misconstrued Hegel's advances, a harking back to Kant and Fichte. Thus Kroner commented on the phenomenology, Hegel renews the subjectivism of Kant and Fichte by raising it to the stage of absolute idealism attained by Schelling. The book counters the idea behind Kant's critique of reason and Fichte's theory of scientific thought with the old identity system of Schelling, thus countering the idea of epistemology. 20 In no sense does that square with the historical facts of the matter. Hegel did not have an epistemology at all in the Kantian sense. He rejected in principle the investigation of the cognitive faculty prior to knowledge. In order to learn to swim, he said, we. 564. The destruction of reason. Must get into the water, by which he meant that the correctness or otherwise of perception, the degree of our ability to know, etc., can be demonstrated only within the concrete cognitive process. Secondly, the phenomenology of the mind contains no sign of a return to the subjectivism of Kant and Fichte. This, for Kant and Fichte, was the cornerstone of their whole philosophy. The function of the phenomenology in Hegel's system at the time was, on the other hand, a representation of the subject's development leading it to the point from which objective philosophy could be adequately mapped out and comprehended. And in line with this methodological task, the phenomenology did not provide an analysis of the structure, capabilities, etc. Of the subject, as did the Kant-Fichte epistemology, but the history of the subject in the course of the objective history of man's development. The work's mixture of historical, psychological and epistemological considerations, faulted by Heim and others, was no failing but a methodologically rigorous carrying out of an intention radically different from that of Kant or Fichte. And Kroner, with his neo-Kantian blinkers, was unwilling even to see this intention, let alone understand it. So the epistemological basis of Neo-Hegelianism remains in essence Kantian. To be sure, this statement does full justice to neither the philosophical nor the historical endeavors of the Neo-Hegelians. In the historical sphere, they carried on the Meineck line. Rosenzweig, an avowed supporter of Meineck, traced back to Hegel the ideological foundations of German national liberalism, that is to say the coupling of former German liberalism with Bismarck. In Hegel, he wrote, the national liberals had found the philosophical rationale for the hard, outwardly oriented power character of the state. Granted, and Rosenzweig himself had to admit this, they were no Hegelians in the stricter sense, but they believed it possible to utilize the substance of the system without needing to cling to the formal letter of the method, and this they were historically entitled to do. 21. Neo-hegelianism. 565. With this glorification of the Hegelian system, that is, its reactionary contents, and this radical rejection of the dialectical method, Rosenzweig believed he had established the ideological continuity in the development of the 19th century German bourgeoisie. Like Meineck, he was presenting Hegel as a forefather of the contemporary reactionary bourgeoisie, as a predecessor and accomplice to Bismarck. Of the neo-Hegelians, Glockner, in particular, most vigorously adopted this line. He wrote monographs on Weischer and Erdmann in order to prove this continuity in the philosophical field as well. Naturally, Glockner knew perfectly well that Weischer, for example, had expressly departed from Hegel. But it was just that which rendered him valuable in the eyes of such Hegelians as Glockner, for he seemed to them an ally in the liquidation of the dialectical method. Weischer, according to Glockner, had preserved what was really lasting in Hegel precisely by turning away from his dialectics. This historical bias now leads us back to Oilthe. In Neo-Hegelianism, Dilthey's discovery of the young Hegel as a vitalist entailed the interpretation and presentation of the young thinker as the authentic Hegel. Hegel's later development, his cultivation of the dialectical method, was seen as a gradual ossifying, as a more or less life-negating logical ordering, etc., of the great achievements of his youth. Within Neo-Hegelianism there were, of course, major distinctions with regard to this question. Kroner, for instance, generally confined himself to representing the historically significant Eta Hegel, while Herbert Marcuse, Hugo Fischer, Glockner, and so on, put the crucial emphasis on Hegel's departure from his youthful vitalism, though they had differing estimations of it. They shared, however, the basic line that the contemporary and forward-looking elements in his work had originated in his youth, whereas the mature Hegel was important only insofar as he had retained those tendencies. Here again Neo-Hegelianism was proceeding in a wholly unhistorical manner. Not only did it completely neglect the essential unity in the young and old Hegel, namely his dialectical method, it also 566. The destruction of reason. Overlooked the real historical changes in Hegel's life and thinking, his support for the French Revolution and the Frankfurt Crisis, the hopes he staked on Napoleon and his corresponding philosophy of history during the Jenner period. And finally the turn of his thought after Napoleon's final defeat, and the building of his definitive system. It would be impossible to answer the primary ch5 correctly without insight into this concrete development. For it shows that even through these vicissitudes, Hegel was able to sustain his logic with continual improvements to it, but without any decisive reconstruction. But for the Neo-Hegelians, as we have seen, Hegel's dialectic did not exist. It was from such a standpoint that Glockner challenged the general view of the dissolution of Hegelianism. This, he claimed, was relevant only to the old Hegel, the skillful systematizer, the Berlin headmaster, the conservative state philosopher. 22. Dilthey, on the other hand, had supposedly discovered the young Hegel who had lighted on the mobile fullness of life, impelling the youthful thinker to resolve the eternal problems of the irrational. This doctrine was not affected by the dissolution of Hegelianism. So it was the old Hegel who was alive at the time. So it was only the old Hegel who died at the time. Thus the present task was a surmounting of the old Hegel in the spirit of the young one. Marcuse, deriving his ideas from Heidegger, drew the following conclusion from the aforestated historical interpretation: at the deepest level Dilthey took up vitalism again where Hegel left off. 23. Considered from the angle of philosophical history, this conception meant bringing Hegel another stage closer to romantic thought. Just as the neo-Kantian line had blurred the distinctions between Hegel's objective idealism and the subjective idealism of Kant and Fichte, so we have here a blurring of all the sharp contrasts dividing Hegel from Schelling and particularly from Schleiermacher, from Friedrich Schlegel, Navilis, Savigny and Adam Miller. This line was taken by Metzger, Troeltsch, Hugo Fischer, etc. and here. Neo-Hegelianism. 567. Again Glockner was the most radical, in that, entirely in Dilthey's spirit, he laid down a close connection between Hegel and Schleiermacher, who in reality passionately opposed each other all their lives. Glockner declared that a history of Hegelianism cannot be written without a history of Schleiermacherism. 24. As we have seen, Kroner himself towed the Kantian line. But when, at the very time of his chef d'oeuvre, Nicolai Hartmann wrote a history of German idealism which strongly emphasized Hegel's affinity with the Romantic thinkers, Kroner hailed the achievement as a first-class compliment to his own. This historical falsification of the origin and effect of Hegelian philosophy, its hypotheses and its growth served a double purpose. One purpose was radically to banish the dialectic from the Hegelian method, correctly understood and seasonably renewed. The second was to make vitalistic irrationalism the constitutive basis of that new synthesis of the whole of German reactionary philosophy for which Neo-Hegelianism was striving. In the introduction to his Hegel analyses, Kroner made the following programmatic declaration: it was a matter of making good the damage caused through the catchword panlogism coined by J.E. Erdmann. This could only be achieved if, for once, we sharply stressed the irrationalistic instead of the rationalistic character of the dialectic. 25. Thus he corrected Erdmann not through a dialectical interpretation of the, intrinsically, likewise misleading term panlogism, but by taking refuge in the dominant trend of imperialistic reactionary thinking, namely irrationalism. In the course of demolishing Hegelian philosophy, the program he had set up was now assiduously developed. Kroner stated, Hegel is without doubt the greatest irrationalist that the history of thought has known. No thinker before him succeeded in illuminating a concept as he did. Hegel is an irrationalist because he brought out the irrational aspect of thought, because he irrationalized thought itself. He is an irrationalist because he is a dialectician, because the dialectic. 568. The destruction of reason itself is irrationalism converted into method, made rational because, finally, dialectical thought is rational come irrational thought. 26. And continuing this train of thought, thinking in its dialectical, speculative form is in itself irrational, that is to say supra-rational, because it is living, it is life thinking itself. 27. And of the phenomenology of the mind Kroner wrote, entirely in the spirit of imperialistic vitalism of the Dilthian variety, here the problem of perceiving is deepened, extended downwards to the problem of experiencing. 28. This expresses quite plainly the turn to irrationalistic vitalism. Kroner differed from Dilthey in only one respect. Dilthey, on the basis of Trendelenburg's critique, had rejected dialectics and achieved the transition from neo-Kantianism to vitalism the long way round, via an enlargement of Kant's epistemological propositions. Kroner, on the other hand, simply called dialectics irrationalism treated as a method. We need not dwell for long on the fact that this neo-Hegelian stance had nothing in common with Hegel. As far as any foreigners of vitalism were about in his time, Hegel always repudiated them with the utmost energy. He would only have laughed in scorn at a downward extension of the problem of perceiving into the problem of experiencing. After all, the fundamental point in his theory of knowledge, this applies to his phenomenology and thus to his earlier thinking also, was that each direct sensation, each experience is just as abstract as the categories of the understanding and reflective determinants. And the precise task of the reason, of the self-perfecting dialectic is to rise above both and to locate the real, concrete defining terms. Granted, Hegel could not have come across irrationalism yet as a central philosophical question, the very term he used only in its exact mathematical sense, but in his generalized analysis of those questions pertaining to Neo-hegelianism. 569. Ledgerizing here, it is clear that he saw in both objective and subjective sets of facts simply problems and tasks for rational, dialectical thought, whereas modern irrationalism has been wont to interpret the case facts to suit its own ends, by treating them basic structures of being. As primary phenomena and eternal confines of thinking, Hegel, therefore, saw in the irrational aspect of mathematics and geometry a beginning and trace of rationality. 29. That is, a set question for dialectical thinking, whose irrationality was resolved dialectically as a matter of course, so nothing was further from Hegel's mind than the neo-Hegelian celebration of the irrational. For that reason Kroner's position was, as a Hegel interpretation, untenable, unscientific, a travesty of the scientific positions of Hegelian philosophy. But it characterized all the more strongly the fundamental bias of neo-Hegelianism, a capitulation in the face of the chief irrationalistic trend of the imperialistic period, of the philosophical preliminaries to fascism. The one original element in Kroner's thinking is that he no longer presented irrationalism as a counter-movement to dialectics, as Dilthey had done, he simply identified dialectics with irrationalism. That was unquestionably a symptom of the deepening crisis. We have frequently observed how irrationalism arises as a specious answer to a concrete question of life, and how it converts elements of the real question into the totality of an untrue, reactionary answer. Philosophically, however, this operation largely took the form of a repudiation of dialectics, the most effective means of diverting into a reactionary channel the genuine forward movement latent in the concrete question. Not until the years of crisis around 1848 did there originate with Kierkegaard a pseudo-dialectic irrationality aimed against the dialectical method. Kroner, of course, went to less trouble than Kierkegaard, contenting himself with passing off his own mediocre vitalistic irrationalism as dialectics. Nowhere do Kroner's contents exceed those of his vitalistic predecessors. All that was new. 570. The destruction of reason. And this is the crisis symptom, was the labeling of the dialectic. Kroner's pronounced allegiance to irrationalism is notable in itself because otherwise, in this respect, he belonged to the moderate wing of neo-Hegelianism. In Glockner the bias was expressed far more radically. Glockner was not wholly satisfied with Kroner's account. For him it did not go far enough. Kroner did not fail to recognize Hegel's irrationalism but emphatically underlined it. But it was presented only by implication, so to speak, as an element of the dialectical method. 30. Glockner, on the contrary, put forward the following program: I would like to bring to awareness the irrational elements contained in all concrete thought in a subtler way than is found in Hegel himself. I would like to show that these elements may be linked with the scientific philosophical method in a non-dialectical way. 31. Accordingly, Glockner sought to transcend Hegel's putative panlogism with a pantragism. This term is familiar to us from the writings of Hegel. Its essential content had already cropped up, among none other than the Hegelians, during the 1848 revolution. Wilhelm Jordan and Ruge in Frankfurt, Weischer in his Memoirs of Stuttgart. At bottom it meant two things. On the one hand, each tragedy in history had to be acknowledged as an eternal decree of it. And on the other hand, the reactionary party to every historical controversy had, objectively, the same justification as the progressive side. It was, therefore, the beginning of the liquidation of Hegel's concept of historical progress. In reality, this concept was by no means a simple optimistic panlogism, on the contrary. Admittedly, Hegel adhered to the idea of progress in man's development, but he clearly perceived that the road was paved with a continuous series of personal and national tragedies. Thus he by no means contested the phenomenon of the tragic, but only moved it. Neo-hegelianism. 571. To the appropriate place in the overall context of history. With the aforesaid Hegelians or sometime Hegelians, on the other hand, we have an approximation to Schopenhauer's anti-historical irrationalism whereby the cosmically tragic factor casts an infamous light on every idea of historical or social progress. Now when Glockner revived this idea, it was more than a philosophical working out of that historical line already familiar to us. It signified a conjunction of neo-hegelianism with the vitalistic tendencies expressed initially in the Nietzschean Amor Fati, then in Simmel's tragedy of culture, and subsequently leading via Spengler to Heidegger's existential nihilism, which was also, in its own way, a pan-tragism. The tendency manifested therein will be obvious to anyone acquainted with the German philosophy of post-war imperialism. It is an approximation of neo-hegelianism to that nihilistic world view of Heidegger or Jaspers which we have already encountered. Along with the transposition of irrationalism, disguised as dialectics, to the center of neo-Hegelian methodology, all dialectics had to be carefully removed from the purportedly renewed Hegel. Some neo-Hegelians carried this out by twisting Hegel's dialectics back, where possible, to Kant's doctrine of antinomies. Principal among them was Kroner, who announced, entirely in the Kantian spirit, philosophy cannot proceed beyond itself, it ends in contradiction. 32 Among the rest of the neo-Hegelians this anti-dialectical trend had a greater prominence still. Siegfried Merrick formulated his position with regard to critical dialectics in the following terms: Kritisismus affirms the dialectical element while rejecting the dialectic. 33 Accordingly Merrick accepted, in the Hegelian term supersession only the preservation and elevation, the Teilhard element, and rejected that which implied a negation of the negation. Let us. 572. The destruction of reason. Remark in passing, so as to illustrate the neo-Hegelians' ignorance of Hegel with a crass example, that the Teilhard in the Hegelian definition of supersession is by no means identical with the negation of the negation. In Hegel the first negation was the decisive element in every supersession, which would be meaningless without it, whereas the negation of the negation signifies the specific concluding stage of a triadic dialectical ordered framework. The confusion is typical inasmuch as here, Merrick was rejecting exactly the conditions of the dialectic most deeply rooted in concrete history. His confusion between simple negation and the negation of the negation was a twofold repudiation of everything that is forward-looking and indeed revolutionary about the dialectical method. On the one hand, behind the Teilhard there lies the intellectual mirroring of an, often violent, historical change, and on the other, the negation of the negation, if set up from the materialist angle, similarly points to the, again, often violent, revolutionary transformation of the social structure, to the antagonistic path of progress as Engels analyzed it in Rousseau's social doctrine when rebutting Dühring. 34 The ignorance of Hegel apparent in his renewer, Merrick, is therefore, a clear indication that Merrick was far less concerned here with him than with Marx. The revolutionary consequences of Marxism were to be refuted pseudo-dialectically, in an co-Hegelian form, just as Bernstein had refuted them in an overtly anti-dialectical way from a neo-Kantian standpoint. While the social tendency had remained the same, Siegfried Merrick too was a social democrat. The philosophical form, in view of the exacerbation of the crisis, the existence of the Soviet Union and of communist parties throughout the world, had changed accordingly in Germany as well. It is only too understandable that a philosophical orientation whose declared intention was conciliation with the reactionary thinking of its time was bound to choose such a policy. But this, like the other points we have stressed, goes to show that Hegel's renewers were treating him as old hat just. Neo-Hegelianism. 573. As much as his detractors had formerly done, and it was only consistent of Merrick to take issue with the Bacchanalian whirl of dialectical concepts in the phenomenology, of which he wrote, in this culmination the dialectic outstrips itself. At this point it really keels over into its own opposite, into meaninglessness. With Glockner, this tendency then turned into a decided irrationalism. Although he defended Hegel against the charge of panlogism, he found it understandable and justified because of Hegel's doctrine of contradiction. I do not count the doctrine of contradiction among the ongoing elements of Hegelian philosophy. 35 One must acknowledge its historical existence, but he personally, Glockner added, could not take it over as a systematizer. Contradiction was, he wrote, a central logical phenomenon. It would find its place within the system, but it did not determine the method. Here too the sharply anti-dialectical character of neo-Hegelianism in all important questions is clearly visible. With a vague, non-committal bow to the dialectic, incarcerated in the nature reserve of a, needless to say, purely subjective, neo-Kantian logic, Glockner contested the possibility of applying it to reality. Hence Glockner summed up the positive and negative sides of Hegel's philosophy as follows: Hegel attempted to think concretely, to philosophize objectively, to exist substantially as a philosopher. Hegel tried to let matters run their own course, to stand aside from realism and idealism, and we. 574. The destruction of reason. Want all this today as well. 36. To be sure, Hegel solved this task in a dialectical way and therefore, in Glockner's eyes, incorrectly from the methodological standpoint. So Neo-hegelianism erased the dialectic of Hegel with the greatest of respect, but just as firmly as Heim or Trendelenburg had done in a sharply polemical form. The one modern thinker to take a positive view of the dialectic, Nicolai Hartmann, treated it entirely as a mystery, as an enigmatic godsend bestowed upon genius. The dialectic cannot be arbitrarily divorced from the Hegelian store of ideas. It devolves on individuals like manna from heaven, and they then use it to produce works which others follow but barely understand, intellectual structures which other men think out only laboriously and circuitously. The talent for dialectical thinking is in that sense eminently comparable with the talent of the artist or genius. Like any gift of the mind, it is rare and not something which can be acquired. 37. This defense to turned Hegel into old hat. For anybody who has really read the phenomenology of the mind and studied a little of its background history must know that the unlearnable quality which Hartmann ascribed to the Hegelian dialectic, and his comparison with the artist's mind, characterizes precisely Schelling's view of the dialectic, but the methodology of the phenomenology was directed with great polemical force against that view and proclaimed the universal accessibility, in principle, of dialectics. Indeed, without doing violence to Hegel, one may say that it was one of the book's chief aims to illustrate the learnable nature of the dialectic, and that one of its purposes as a whole was to guide conventional thinking to dialectics step by step. Here again the serious error in interpretation was not so important, except as a symptom, more so was the inherent capitulation to the aristocratic epistemology of irrationalism. And this tendency appears in the constructions put on Hegel, in respect of every question, by the otherwise very different thinkers of the time. It indicates the utter defenselessness of the German intelligentsia in the face of the irrationalist fascist takeover of philosophy. Neo-hegelianism. 575. Thus we observe that the Hegel, whose Renaissance German imperialism had brought about, had nothing to do with Hegel's progressive tendencies, either historically or systematically. Everything conservative or reactionary about his system, on the other hand, was carefully retained and fondly cultivated. We have been able to note exactly from many individual accounts that it was just the dialectical method which became the main victim of this Hegel renewal, and that was far from an accident. For Hegelian dialectics are not one method among many others in modern philosophy. In origin and essence they marked a continuation, on a higher plane, of the efforts of the finest minds since the Renaissance to try and argue philosophically the rationality and progressiveness of man's development. The higher plane achieved by Hegel derived from the new historical situation in which he had to comprehend rationality and progressiveness, the socio-historical situation created through the French Revolution. That entailed two things. Firstly, Hegel comprehended reason in its contradictory nature, that is, in contrast to the general Enlightenment tradition which often, though by no means always, presented the connection between reason and life in an all too direct, straightforward way. He perceived in contradiction itself the objective process whereby reason takes distinct shape in life. In simplifying and vulgarizing this inseparable unity of contradiction and reason, in calling it panlogism, Hegel's successors were already deviating from his dialectical method. In Neo-hegelianism, as we have seen, the polemics against this deviation turned into an equation of dialectics and irrationalism, a total falsification of the Hegelian method, in that rationality, hitherto merely vulgarized, now vanished from the method completely. Secondly, the dialectical method signified a historical defense of progress. The philosophical reaction which followed upon the French Revolution had established a view of the historical process from which the idea of progress had disappeared, and which declared every social revolution in particular to be anti-historical. The gist of the Hegelian dialectical method was, on 576, the destruction of reason. The other hand, and this is inseparably united with the central place of contradictoriness, the proof that the convoluted, irregular paths of history themselves reveal its profound rationality, which is often not immediately visible. Hence the founders of dialectical and historical materialism were able to ally themselves with Hegel. They did so, of course, on the basis of a relentless critique of his idealism, his reactionary system, and so forth. The depth and universal range of this critique, the qualitatively new character of Marxism by comparison with Hegel, and the antithetical cast of the new materialist dialectical method as compared to Hegel's idealist dialectic do not, however, remove the fact of the critical alliance. After all, dialectical and historical materialism is the philosophy in which progress and ration ally cognizable principles of history are expressed in their highest form, the only philosophy which can argue the case for progressiveness and rationality in a fully consistent way. That Neo-hegelianism was, without always publicly admitting it, in all a polemical sally against the Marxist reshaping of the Hegelian dialectic we have already seen. We have seen also that the scientific form of this polemic was a downright distortion of Hegelian thought. It took away its dialectic, progressiveness and rationality. Thus Neo-hegelianism, which in its subjective aims often resembled an effort to resist the despotism of irrationalist vitalism, led into the main tidal waters of the imperialist destruction of reason. The renewing of Hegel signifies nothing more, here, than an attempt by moderate reactionary sectors of the German bourgeoisie to reach a compromise with the reactionary extremists. The attempt was a failure. Philosophically, the victory of the reactionary groups in the imperialist bourgeoisie led to the victory of the most extreme irrationalist vitalism, and this in its most debased form, that of National Socialist philosophy. The Neo-Hegelians naturally tried to carry out a compromise policy with regard to overt fascism as well. This effort had a specific external basis, Hitler, with an eye to Neo-Hegelianism. 577. Foreign relations had somehow to keep the universities ticking over, and the Neo-Hegelians were known to be sufficiently reactionary for a triumphant National Socialism to tolerate them. So Neo-Hegelianism continued to vegetate. In Göttingen there even sprang up a special Neo-Hegelian school of law philosophy. The publication of collected source material, monographs, etc., went on. The Neo-Hegelians made various attempts at a rapport with the Hitler regime, all commending Hegel as a trustworthy reactionary ideologist. Of these very numerous attempts let us give just one example. Herbert Franz rested his case on the claim that in Italy Hegel was the political philosopher of fascism, whereas in Germany he has to suffer some hostility at present. Were we to concern ourselves with Hegel as much as this great mind truly deserves, we would soon recognize that the Hegelian concept of government largely takes into account just those conditions of vitality. The physicality of the organic cycle and popular feeling manifested as spirit which are intended to raise the rich and vital concept of national government above the mediocre, humdrum concept of a schematic state machine. 38 Thus Hitler received a bouquet of all the reactionary contents of the Hegelian system, presented in order to make him more benevolently disposed towards Hegelianism. These attempts misfired. In an official statement in which he sharply divided the National Socialist worldview from the fellow travelers' attempts at conciliation, Rosenberg declared that National Socialism regarded only Wagner, Nietzsche, Lagarde and Chamberlain as intellectual forerunners. As its own classical authorities 39 Now it is widely known that both Lagarde and Chamberlain were sharply opposed to Hegel. Lagarde declined to recognize Hegel along with the majority of thinkers and imaginative authors of the classical epoch. As a German, our classical literature of the previous century is German in the persons of 578. The destruction of reason. Individual bearers of the tradition, but not as writers, it is, on the one hand, cosmopolitan, and, on the other, it strives after Greek and Roman ideals. In scholasticizing the content of this body of literature, Hegel typically passed over precisely its best parts. 40 As for Chamberlain, he saw in Hegel a Protestant Thomas Aquinas. 41 A phrase which for him says it all because Chamberlain, as we shall note in due course, saw in Rome the champion of the ruinous chaos of nations. And since he saw the founder of his own racial philosophy in a Kant interpreted in a vitalistic, racialistic and mystical light, he scornfully dismissed the thesis of the uniformity of philosophical developments from Kant to Hegel. Kant is the outstanding representative of the purely scientific answer, but ignorant or malicious hacks are still misleading the public with the assertion that the thinking of Fichte and Hegel is organically connected with Kant's, thereby preventing any true understanding or serious deepening of our worldview. Rosenberg followed these lines in his fierce challenge to Hegel. 42 He expressed in clear terms the cardinal element in the reactionary extremists' rejection of Hegel, his relation to Marxism. This repulsed at one stroke all the compromise attempts of the Social Democrats from Bernstein to Siegfried Merrick, as well as the post-war Neo-Hegelians. On this ch5, the National Socialist theoretician would not stand for any compromise. As we shall see, Rosenberg furthermore firmly rejected both rationality in the study of world history and the Hegelian theory of the state. This shows us how fruitless all the Neo-Hegelians' attempts at good relations were with pre-fascist and fascist reaction. The reactionaries were moving towards the total destruction of reason. Compromise, concessions counted for little in their eyes, they demanded all or nothing. Through its concessions to vitalistic irrationalism, Neo-Hegelianism managed only to disarm mentally a part of the intelligentsia that would have perhaps resisted the fascist takeover of thought more strongly had it not had such an ideological prop. The official thinking of German fascism now assiduously. Neo-Hegelianism. 579. Carried out the anti-Hegelian line traced in advance by Rosenberg. Alfred Biemler, who was appointed professor of political studies at the University of Berlin immediately after Hitler's seizure of power, spelled out this program in his inaugural address. The systematic critique of the idealist tradition is a part of our future work. 43 And drawing on the preparatory studies of Meineck, Rosenzweig and Glockner. With, to be sure, the value sign reversed, he attacked Hegel as a philosopher of despicable national liberalism. National liberalism, whose ideological basis was laid by Hegel, was the most recent form of that synthesis of Enlightenment and Romantic thought which Nietzsche was summoned to abolish. 44 Now when Nietzsche was, according to Biemler, rightly challenging the state of his time, he was instinctively right in taking the Hegelian total state as a culture state. Nietzsche is contesting the spirit of Goethe's Weimar made concrete in the state. 45 Obviously all German fascists were behind Biemler in disputing any possible association of their state with culture. Official Hitlerian thinking was now challenging in actual philosophical terms the image of Hegel as the completion of that great and universally European movement which began with Descartes. Thus Hegel too belonged to those dangerous Western imports which National Socialism would have to eliminate. This is most clearly stated in the book written by Franz Böhm. With Descartes, the man tied to Western civilization in his unity and national roots was replaced by the creation of an unreal and non-dart European man. Full stop. Historical rationality. 46. This development reached its climax in Hegel. Hegel perfected Western awareness as regards the history of thought in a way that has not been surpassed. Dart for it is Hegel's picture of history which gave Cartesianism its standing justification, after the best minds in German philosophy had led the battle against it down the centuries. Just as, conversely, Hegel's universalist conception steamrolled the motives of German history of philosophy into Western thought and 580. The destruction of reason. Partly buried them for a century. 47. This was a logical extension of the fascist attack on Hegel to the whole of European rational philosophy. Hegel was under fire for having completed the separation from medieval philosophy that began with Descartes. It was a formulation, in terms of the history of thought, of the war of extermination vowed by Hitler's supporters against progressive European civilization and culture in their entirety. Here again, of course, the fascist ideologists were not showing any originality. We are already acquainted with the anti-Hegelian tradition from Schopenhauer to Chamberlain. But the thesis that the attack on Hegel had to commence historically with Descartes also has old roots in reactionary thought. The old Schelling initiated it, and he had successors in Eduard von Hartmann and his school. And the fact that we are, objectively speaking, dealing once more with those questions which we underlined earlier as being the central ones is indicated by Böhm's attacks on the concept of progress. Progress is a gradual heightening of present conditions. This denies the historical process all creative character and disables the future by a monstrous act of anticipation. 48. As always in such polemics, Böhm was ignoring Hegel's dialectical and historical concept of progress and putting forward the vulgar concept as the only possible one. So Neo-hegelianism with its imperialist reactionary adjustments to Hegel was unable to establish itself as the synthesis of all orientations after which it hankered. It eked out a tolerated existence in a few small corners of the German universities. Its results for the development of philosophy were precisely nil. The only historical interest that this trend evokes is a negative one. It plainly shows us how ineffective philosophical compromises are, how resistance, unless decided, is swept helplessly along by the main reactionary currents, and the unimportance of nuances and reservations in world historical upheavals. The development of Neo-hegelianism is instructive inasmuch as it provides a philosophical reflection of the role that an increase. Neo-hegelianism. 581. In the decaying liberalism not only played in the history of the reactionary upsurge, the fascist takeover, but will also play in the future. Notes. 1 Marx, Capital, Vol 1, afterward to the second edition. 2 Windelband, Die Erneuerung des Hegelianismus, Report of the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences, Heidelberg 1910, page 7, 3 Ibid, page 13, 4 Ibid, page 15, 5 Jules. Ebbinghaus, R. Relativer und absoluter Idealismus, Leipzig 1910, page 31, 6 Ibid, page 4, 7 Ibid, page 69, 8 Dilthey, Collected Work S, Leipzig Berlin 192 1, Vol 4, pages 219 F9 Ibid, p. page 229 F10 Ibid, page 138. 1 Menek, World Citizenship and the National State 1-2 Logos, Hegel Issue, 1931, page 9, 13 minutes OF the 1 St. Hegel Congress, Tübingen 1931, page 25, 14 Ibid, page 78, 15s. Merrick, Die Dialektik in der Philosophik der Gegenwart, Tübingen 1929-31, Vol 1, page 33, 16r. Kroner, von Kant zu Hegel, Tübingen 1921-4, Vol 1, page 25, 17 minutes of the 1 St. Hegel Congress, page 79, 18r. Kroner, von Kant zu Hegel, Vol 1, page 21, 19 Ibid, page 27, 20 Ibid, Vol 1I, page 364, 21f. Rosenzweig, Hegel und der Staat, Munich Berlin 1920, Vol 1I, pages 198 F22H Glockner, FTH. Weischer und das 19, 800, Berlin 1931, pages 155 FF23H. Marcuse, Hegels Ontologie und die Grundlegung einer Theorie der Geschichtlichkeit, Frankfurt AM 1932, page 278. 24H Glockner, Krisen und Wandlungen in der Geschichte des Hegelianismus, Logos, 13 No. 3, pages 355 F25R. Kroner, von Kant zu Hegel, Vol 1I, ppvll F26 Ibid, pages 271 F27 Ibid, page 282, 28 Ibid, page 364. 582. The Destruction of Reason. 29 Hegel, Encyclopedia, Pera 231, 30H. Glockner, Hegel, Vol 1, Stuttgart 192-9, pp. Ziff 31 Ibid, page 21, 32 R. Kroner, Die Selbstverwirklichung des Geistes, Tübingen 192-8, page 221, 33 S. Merrick, Opsit, Vol 1I, p. 9334 Engels, ANTI during 35H Glockner, Hegel, PXII 36IBID, page 14, 37 N. Hartmann, Hegel, Berlin 1929, pages 17F38H, Franz Z. von Herder his Hegel, Frankfurt AM 1938, page 149. 39 Rosenberg, Gestaltende ID, Munich 1936, p. page 11F40 Laggard, Drei Deutsche Schriften, Leipzig, pages 204 F41 Chamberlain, The Foundations of the 19th Century 42 Rosenberg, The Myth of the 20th Century. 43 Biemler, Me Eineband und Wissenschaft, Berlin 1934, page 125, 44 Biemler, Nietzsche, Der Philosoph und Politiker, Leipzig 1931, page 134, 45 Ibid, page 133, 46 Böhm, Anticartesianismus, Leipzig 1938, page 55, 47 Ibid, pages 24 F